try to limit my Seahawks Patriots comments here at this point. Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining Global Gene's Patient Advocacy Unsummit today. We appreciate you taking time to join us. My name is Scott Schliebner, Senior Vice President, Center for Rare Diseases at PRA Health Sciences, and I'll be your moderator today for our session entitled Operationalizing Patient Inclusivity and Maintaining Compliance. We appreciate you being here wherever you may be, morning, afternoon, or evening. We're joined by a great team today that's bi-coastal in the United States. We have a Boston, Seattle team. If you may have heard some of our football comments earlier, we're trying to keep things light on this Friday. So thank you again for being here. Before we jump in and get started, just a couple quick housekeeping notes for me to run through. First, as attendees, you'll all be muted throughout the session to avoid interruptions. However, we do have the chat function, which you might be familiar with at this point, off to the right. Please, we welcome all comments and questions you have. We'd love for you to participate a little bit with us. So please use that chat button. To open the chat, click on the blue chat button located in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to answer all questions. For any that we don't have time to get to today, we will follow up with the questioners following the session and make sure we address your comments. Also, make sure to post any of your top takeaways or lessons learned from this event on social media and tag @GlobalGenes. The hashtag event, official hashtag event is hashtag 2020GG Summit. So feel free to post that out there, and we'll see if we can get you featured on the Global Genes social media channel. Let's see here. We've already talked about questions. I think we're ready to get going and introduce our amazing speakers we have here today. So first we have Fernanda Copeland, who is Executive Director and Global Head of Patient Advocacy and Engagement at AVRO Bio. And we also have Chad Morin, the Chief Compliance Officer at Bluebird Bio. I'll give each of them a quick chance to just further introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into some questions. So Fernanda, would you like to introduce yourself a little further?
Sure. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everybody at Global Genes for organizing the conference, the Unsummit, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this important topic on how we can continue to advance the partnership between patients and industry. It's an honor to be here. I am Fernanda Copeland. I'm the head of patient advocacy at AVRO Bio. I've been there for over 2.5 years now, and from the beginning of starting to engage with patients, I've been there I'm a registered dietitian by training, and I worked with patients for 10 years in a clinical setting, outpatient and inpatient, before joining the industry role, helping patients better manage their conditions and advancing education to empower and help patients with shared decision-making. At AVROBIO right now, I ensure that the patient perspective is taken into consideration and consider equal stakeholders in our development, from our preclinical programs all the way to the commercialization. It's an honor to be here today. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks,
Thanks
Fernanda.
so much, Fernanda.
Yeah, over to you, Chad.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you, everyone, for allowing us the opportunity to come here and share our thoughts. I'm Chad Morin. I am the Global Chief Compliance Officer at Bluebird Bio, heading up our compliance and ethics function. For those of you that don't know Bluebird Bio, we are a gene therapy company. And, you know, I've been at Bluebird for about 3.5 years. It's been kind of amazing to see, you know, how the industry as a whole has progressed as they engage with patients and patient advocates. And I'm happy to go ahead and share my thoughts here. And I would be remiss by our legal colleagues at my company if I didn't say that these are my own thoughts and opinions and not reflective of Bluebird. I'm not a lawyer, and just very happy to be able to join everyone here.
Excellent. Thank you both. Thanks for joining us and for your time. You both work for really interesting, innovative organizations, and I think you each bring a different, unique perspective. With our audience that I'm speculating that we have here today, as is typical, this group seems to understand the need to involve patients in the drug development process, the importance of the patient voice. I don't think we need to go down that path too much today. We're kind of preaching to the choir in that respect. However, you know, when we're including the patient voice and we're thinking about patient inclusivity, a lot of us who are not on the industry side don't understand that there are some restrictions and some rules and some regulations. And so I guess really to kind of kick things off, the main question I think I'd like to sort of direct at Fernanda is, you know, how do we strike the right balance between including patients and ensuring patient inclusivity while also adhering to compliance requirements that we have?
Thanks, Scott. And so when we think about the big picture of where to start, we start with the mentality that we engage patients as equal stakeholders in the drug development, with the goal of co-developing these therapies together with the patients to better serve the individuals who will potentially benefit from these therapies at some point. It's important for everybody in industry and also on the patient advocacy side to recognize and understand the local and global rules and regulations that exist, you know, about engaging patients and industry during the drug development. And they vary tremendously from country to country. And hopefully we can talk more about that a little later today. And then we adhere to good clinical practice, meaning there is a common understanding between industry and patient groups that we don't speak with patients who are part of clinical trials. So that's what we call good clinical practice. We can speak with them before the clinical trials. We can speak with them after, but not during. And we work with and we utilize the IRB processes, internal review boards, for any clinical communications and engagement with patients.
Thanks, Fernanda. Chad, did you want to chime in there as well?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think Fernanda hit on some very, very good points, right? I mean, I think across all of industry, you know, not only do we hear it from the different patient groups as well as caregivers and others, but we're actually even hearing this about the need to incorporate the patient voice by regulators, right? The FDA, the EMA. These, you know, it is no longer a company trying to identify a disease and going after that and being innovative. You have to include that patient voice, and you have to be able to do that to understand kind of the burden on the patients and the caregivers and the families particularly in a clinical setting, right? And understanding what endpoints make sense, not only from a scientific and medical perspective, but make sense to the patient community. And I think, as Fernanda illustrated, frequent and often, especially very early on, is very important as these companies are designing these trials, so that when we do bring hopefully, potentially, life-saving or life-altering transformative medications to patients, that they do meet the needs of the patient community and contribute to a better overall quality of life.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, I think that striking that right balance is the challenge. And when you're dealing with, we're trying to incorporate a lot of different stakeholders in the process, be they industry regulators, patients, patient advocates. Some people might be more educated around the process. Some might have less exposure to industry. I think sometimes we all strive to do the right thing, but then we do have some boundaries around it we just need to be aware of. So thanks for kind of outlining that at a high level. All right, so when we want to operationalize this patient inclusivity, what are some of the roadblocks you see when you want to engage patients really throughout the R&D, but also well into kind of the commercial life cycle as well?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kick that off, Scott. Yeah, it's difficult, right? I think it varies based on company by company, but right now there is a high amount of scrutiny on what the industry does when they engage with patients and patient advocacy organizations and patient support organizations, right? And frankly speaking, some of this is because we did have some bad actors and people doing things that should not have been done. But as you think about the different companies and how they engage, I think it's also mindful to keep what is the size of that company? Where are they on that road from research through clinical development through commercialization? And I get this question a lot of times, or I got this a lot of times when I first joined Bluebird is, well, we used to be able to do this, or we used to be able to do this with the patients or the advocacy groups. And then like, well, Chad, you're saying you can't do that anymore. And frankly, it's because the risk profile of the company changes. When you are a startup that's like 20 people and you're trying to understand, okay, how does this disease affect the patients and the patient community? What are scientific, meaningful endpoints for these clinical trials that will help bring these therapies to patients in need? You can have those very, very close collaborations with the advocacy groups and the patients that are affected with it because you are so far off from commercialize, basically that product going through multiple phases of trials and then eventually getting commercialized. And really, when, from a government perspective and where they care about it is when there's transfers of money, right? Because they think, at least certain individuals within the enforcement agency think that just because a company or industry is engaging with the patient community, they're only doing it because it benefits them on the bottom line. And that's not always the case. And in fact, many times that's not the case at all because, I'm sure I can speak for Fernanda as well as myself. Like, we didn't get into this industry because of that, right? We're getting into it because we've been affected by these diseases and our families, and we want to make a difference, right? But from an enforcement perspective, as you get closer to commercialization, as you're going through these trials, there's more scrutiny on what a company is doing and how you're engaging with them and why you're engaging with them. And that's why, when you enter into the clinic, for example, individuals or patients that are going to the clinic, there's, company has to be hands off. Because you want to make sure you're maintaining the integrity of that clinical trial, that you're not influencing it. And many times, that's why if you participate in a clinical trial, even in the informed consent, there's language in there that says you should not be posting about this or talking about it on social media. And it's not because the company or the hospital are trying to stop you from talking about it. It's because we want to maintain the integrity of the trial and the data that's there so that from an enforcement perspective, nobody says that, well, you're trying to do pre-approval promotion. You're trying to get the word out there about the data before it's approved and can be used for, the public in need, right? And so it really is kind of it's a give and pull and a little bit of a struggle at times as companies evaluate each type of interaction we may have with a patient, a caregiver, a patient advocacy organization to say, okay, based on the very, very loose guidelines that are out there, because unlike how we engage with healthcare professionals where there's very black and white rules, it's very gray engaging with patients and the patient community. And so based on these very loose rules, what are going to be our guiding principles, and how are those guiding principles going to change as we get closer to commercialization, so that people don't think that we are doing pre-approval promotion, that we're not trying to openly spread our data before we can go ahead and promote it, right? And so it really is, I know you probably hear this from lawyers and others in compliance community all the time. It depends on where the company is. It depends what the interactions are. But ultimately, what I kind of want to get away from this is, as a company goes through their lifespan, the compliance concerns change, right? And it's not because the company doesn't want to help the patient community. It's because of the scrutiny on how they're doing that continues to evolve as they go on.
Yeah, that's really well said. So, and as a company moves along that kind of timeline towards commercialization, if I understand it, it sounds like you need to almost be more self-restrictive in a way and a little more limiting in what you can do, just because almost of the perception of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great way of putting that, Scott. And an example of it is maybe a company early on when they're doing their early data or preclinical data, or even like phase 1 trial data, they may share that within a patient community, especially if it's a very, very small patient community, right? Or they may share that with the leadership of a patient advocacy organization. However, based on the way that the FDA's guidelines are, that's considered scientific exchange, right? So that should only be communicated, that medical data, which is not approved for promotion, can only be communicated in a reactive manner between a healthcare professional, a physician, and the company itself. And so as they move through, that's why you may have a company that says, you know what, yes, we shared this 2 years ago, but now you need to have, a medical director or somebody that is a licensed healthcare professional on your team, and we can only communicate it to them. And then if they want to share that, they can. But this way here, it falls within kind of this envelope of scientific exchange. And so it really does kind of depend and evolve. And as companies get closer to commercial, they tend to get a little bit more tight-lipped. And it's not because they, like I said, they don't want to share that, right? They want to keep the patient community informed. It's just a different risk profile from how the enforcement agencies may look at it.
Yeah. I think it's important to share that. I think there could be, even for me, somebody who lives a little bit more further upstream on the R&D side, and I interact with patients and advocates a lot, some of these restrictions aren't necessarily known to a lot of us. You mentioned small communities. We have a question from the audience, Fernanda, I thought I could direct over to you. This question is, in a very small patient community, it is sometimes difficult to avoid contact with trial participants. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So if that's okay, is it okay for me to add a little bit to what Chad mentioned? Because I agree with everything he said.
Please.
And I think he touched on the changing environment from early development to closer to commercialization. So I think there are a few themes there, which is the getting closer to commercialization. There's also what he mentioned about limited guidelines that are different in every geography, making it tricky. And I think as we would like to make it better, right now there is no distinction. I really liked what you said, Chad, about going from being able to share data freely to then being able to work with a HCP, healthcare professional from the company, to sharing it, and then working with the organizations and healthcare professionals outside the organization to utilize as a step to sharing that. And I think that's really good. At least I view that as a step-by-step things that people can do in order to get access to this information. So I really like that you said that. And then last, in terms of the challenges, is I think in the United States, we need to be able to advance to be able to distinguish our engagement between patients and then patient advocacy leaders. Because when we're talking about eco-stakeholders, right? So investors, clinicians, patient advocacy leaders should have access to the information at the same time. But advocacy leaders sometimes can be the voice for the industry, for the patient community. So that's one way that we can do it. Thank you. I hope that's okay that I said that. And then I agree with smaller communities and being hard to keep that distance, right? And I think it goes hand in hand a little bit with what Chad said early in development. It's okay. One way that I have found helpful to engage with patients, because it's great to engage with patients. There is nothing more meaningful for researchers and industry to learn how in the future therapy can potentially benefit a community. So it's really great. One way that I think it's helpful is to have a buffer in the middle or a third party, whether it's sometimes it's a patient advocacy agency, sometimes it's a CRO, sometimes it's clinicians or patient groups, and that's the buffer that can be. And it just protects everybody. So that's how I feel. Not always very early in development or to help the organizations develop and form. I think it's okay to work closer. But one of the basic principles of patient advocacy in industry is to establish the independence between industry and patient organizations. So it's okay to engage with patients in order to help them form something like that, but with the goal being to develop a separate and independence from industry and patients. And that's to benefit everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Fernanda. We have another question from our audience. Fernanda, maybe you could get us started on this one. This is from someone who's sort of thinking about creating space for patients in the medical community. And this question is, what do you think is the most important thing that patients, caregivers, advocates can share with industry? I don't know if there's one thing that comes to mind. So if you can narrow that down for us.
I think there has been a few organizations that have successfully. So I find that some of the conferences that medical professionals attend, as well as patient advocates attend, are no longer just a medical conference. So I think creating a space in different conferences where patients and clinicians and industry or patient advocacy groups leadership can all interact in the same space is very helpful. So that's one of the ways that I see happening, this partnership advancing. And can you repeat your question? Just make sure I answered all of it.
Sure. It was really just sort of what would be kind of the most important thing patients or advocates could share with industry?
Yeah. I think we all learn from stories, and I'm sure you've heard that before, but I have heard stories how a patient, caregiver, or advocate has been able to provide input that helped an endpoint in a trial, and how it helps save time, money, bring a therapy closer to the market faster. It's invaluable for industry. And obviously I'm working in patient advocacy, so I've seen it live, I've seen it happen, but continue to share those measurable things, those I think that's very valuable. A story is beyond a story that is heartwarming or that is sad, but it's a patient advocacy is it's a business function, right? So being able to link the stories to what it can do to bringing therapies to the market as fast as possible and safely as possible and compliant as possible.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you. There was a question I was getting ready to ask, but we also have another question from our audience that kind of dovetails nicely in with that. So to encourage this awesome audience engagement, let's go right to that question here. So, Chad, I was going to ask you about the guidelines that exist really around compliance. We talked about how it's a little loose, and maybe you may even have to self-govern as you move closer to commercialization. The question we have from the audience is, where can we review some basic compliance regulations?
Yep.
And I'll read the second part. I'm beginning to think my biopharma partners have 10,000 compliance officers. So in terms of providing resources or giving people a sense of what's out there, do you have any direction for us?
Yeah, sure, Scott. I mean, I wish I had 10,000 people to do this with me. Unfortunately, I think in most biotechs, especially small ones, it's usually 1, 2 people. I think 3 at the most, especially if you're operating in multiple geographies. And so, you know, you're balancing, as Fernanda kind of alluded to, these different requirements, right? And they really vary based on country and geography. You know, I'm a pretty big fan of UCOPA. So they have published, this was probably a few years ago now, some principles around engaging with patient and patient groups. You know, and so that one's pretty good. IFPMA, which is International Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies and Association, they also have some. PhRMA, which is the U.S. Trade Association, they have some guidelines. You know, and what's interesting about all these guidelines, and these are all industry groups, right? So this isn't governmental bodies coming and saying this is how you can interact, because, you know, from a government perspective, basically they say you can't do pre-approval promotion, so you can't talk about a product before it's considered safe and efficacious by a regulatory agency, so this is the FDA or EMA, right? And that's really about it, right? And then within Europe itself, as well as most of the world, actually, you can't do what's considered direct-to-consumer promotion, right? So even once the product is approved in these other markets, with the exception of the US, Mexico, and New Zealand, you can't talk directly to patients from industry, right? So that's even further restrictions, right? So that's the governmental regulations. And from these trade group, you know, essentially they have these pillars, and the pillars kind of revolve on, you know, 2 main things is kind of what I always bring back is, you know, independence, which Fernanda already kind of touched on, right? It's maintaining that independence for that patient group, because they are not an extension of your company, nor should they be an extension of your company, right? They need to be operating in the best interest of the patient community. And sometimes that may be to collaborate with the company on generating disease material, to educate further on it, or you know, provide feedback into endpoints or other things, right? But at all times, you need to make sure that that boundary and that line is clear. And different companies take different approaches to that independence pillar. Some of them do it where they will only fund certain events a certain amount, right? They don't want to be funding it more than 30%, 40%, 50% for an engagement that's happening, right? Which is very hard sometimes for some of these groups where, you know, it's an ultra rare indication and there's only 1 or 2 companies operating in that space. And, you know, frankly, you're going to go to the companies that help provide funding so you can educate your patient community, right? There's not a lot of fundraising avenues always for some of these disease areas. And so maintaining that independence is huge. And I think the other main pillar that you see kind of carry throughout all of these guidelines is around mutual respect, right? You can't be taking advantage of the patient community. You can't be taking advantage of the patients, right? And that goes into many different things of, you know, you compensate them fairly for their time. You know, you don't try to manipulate their words, their thoughts, their actions, right? You don't take advantage of them in that aspect. If you are using them in a campaign where you're using their, you know, their image or, you know, their voice or their story, right? You contractually have that, right? You're not just taking these things and using them as a whim. So, you know, I always tell my team and, you know, here, you know, within, you know, Bluebird as well as other companies I've worked in, is if you're maintaining those 2 main pillars of mutual respect and ensuring that you're maintaining the independence with those organizations, then we'll probably be okay, right? I mean, obviously, as the risk profiles change in those different therapeutic areas, we have to modify as need be to avoid the regulatory side that I touched on before. But, you know, if I had to recommend something, go take a look at UCOPA, because I think that's probably at least the most concrete. And I think it's 4 or so pillars that they outline, but they kind of all go around those 2 same themes.
Thanks, Chad. That actually kind of really kind of simplifies it a little bit. Something that's probably complex and not super clear, charcoal gray, I think we talked about earlier. Fernanda, anything you'd like to add to that question?
No, I think it was really well said. I think from the patient advocacy perspective is the responsibility from industry to make sure to communicate with patient advocacy leaders on what is possible and why. And then the responsibility from the patient advocacy leaders to communicate with their community on why. So patient advocacy professionals in industry are working to make patients equal stakeholders in drug development. And so patient advocacy outside of industry also need to recognize industry as one of the partners, right? And then educate their communities on industry regulations, make sure that the patients are aware that there are rules and they help everybody. So industry needs to be clear about when those interactions can happen, and then the leaders of organizations need to be clear with their communities on what can be done and why, or why not.
I have a lot of empathy for your guys' roles. I think you're put in challenging situations where you're pushed and pulled between requirements in industry, yet trying to do the best thing for patients. And I don't know if that's always necessarily obvious to some people out there. So thanks for what you do. So that idea of engaging with patients, I think with this audience, I think we understand there's a lot of good reasons to do so. Maybe do so early, often, create authentic, real, transparent partnerships. Fernanda, maybe you could get us started on just some of the ways we might be engaging with patients in this changing landscape, and especially maybe a little bit around social media and the unique challenges that poses for us.
Yes, thanks, Scott. Yes, so social media and digital media in general, it's kind of a wild, wild west. And I mean, we've all experienced in the last 7 months that we have been in COVID times, how things have changed and just escalated, and it's in everybody's radar, right? We are right now, we're benefiting from a different way of participating in an unsummit conference. And one of the things that we do in patient advocacy is to meet the patients where they are. And one of the easy ways of doing so is in digital media such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, which is really great. However, Facebook has developed actually a lot of community guidelines that we need to follow in industry. There are a lot of regulations that we need to follow. And then we also but it's a wonderful way of sharing information. And just like Chad was saying, it's not information, it's not promoting, it's just, it's doing what we're supposed to do as patient advocates, making people aware of what research is out there. So people from different parts of the world and different, different professions can have access to information about research and advances. However, there needs to be a clear understanding on what can be done or not communicated in social media due to the things that Chad was mentioning earlier, such as jeopardizing the integrity of a study. So industry follows very tight regulations on what we can communicate and not. And then we also ask that our advocacy partners follow those guidelines and regulations as well. So, because with being a stakeholder and a partner also comes responsibility. So we also ask advocacy and patients to follow guidelines and not share information about the study on social media and comments, and that can jeopardize the study and really impact a lot of people. Because if it damages the study, if adverse events get out, or then it can impact a lot of people and delay the development of the therapy for the entire community. So those are some of the challenges with social media. I'm just very grateful to social media, and it's tricky, but I'm glad that it's there, and it's a wonderful place for everybody to connect. It's just very immature in how we engage in social media at this point, and not a lot of people have had experience with it. It's very early, so the rules and regulations are still being developed, and the same way that we need to educate patients and patient groups on how to engage with it, we also need to educate internally on the guardrails that we are putting in order to make this possible. It's tricky, but it's a place where we can communicate with a large audience and pursue the mission of educating and making people aware of research.
Great. Thanks for your thoughts, Fernanda. We've got a good question here from our audience. Chad, maybe you could take the first stab at this one. The question is, should patient advocates get compliance training? And I guess I would add to that, if you think it's wise, are there some avenues or sources that they could be directed to educate themselves a little more?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess it varies, right? Every company has a different approach to compliance. And, I think if you have a moment, you can read those principle-based guidelines, right? I think that's a huge step to understanding a little bit of the challenges where industry has. But you can also look at, if you really want to dive into it, some of the enforcement actions that are currently happening to industry around their interactions with patients, as well as their interactions with patient support and patient assistance programs, right? I mean, that's a huge issue right now from the industry. Is we as an industry were directed to give money to foundations, give money to assistance programs for patients, and then with very little oversight and guidance from the government. When the government has come back and said, actually, you should not be getting as much information back. It should be more independent. It should be you shouldn't be using this information that way. And so I think it goes back to that independence principle, right? But an interesting case, which kind of dovetail into this question as well as around social media, is actually Kim Kardashian. And I'm sure everyone's wondering, why is Chad bringing up Kim Kardashian in this conversation? But we talk about using social media and engaging in social media appropriately. And there's no real true rules around this. There's some high level guidelines that the government has given. But there was a company that actually engaged Kim Kardashian as a patient. She had morning sickness, and she was pregnant. I think everyone in the world knew that she was pregnant through her various social media channels. And they engaged with her and said, hey, you're a patient. We'd love for you to go ahead and promote our morning sickness medication. And so she said, great. And so she was paid as a patient to promote this via social media. And I think this is relevant for everyone that's listening to this right now, because you could have a company reach out to you and say, we like your patient story. We'd like you to be a paid spokesperson or to promote this, approved medication on social media. And where she ran afoul, and where the company ran afoul, is because she is using social media, because she is essentially being compensated by that company to do so, she falls under the same promotional rules as the company. And, pharmaceutical companies have an obligation to promote and talk about their medicine in a fair and non-misleading manner that is balanced, right? It talks about the good and the bad. And in her case, she only talked about the great things that this morning sickness medication did. And she actually, as a patient, got a warning letter from the government that said, you need to delete this post and you need to repost something that is balanced, that talks about the side effects also, right? So in terms of looking at different guidances, right, I think if you know those general principles, you can do some Google searches on, enforcement around patients or patient advocates or patient support programs, and that may be the best way to learn about it. To my knowledge, there isn't a course that's given for patient advocates, but I think that may be a great place and something that is probably needed as this continues to evolve in the industry.
Great example. Thanks for keeping that real for us. That's helpful. And yes, probably the first Kim Kardashian reference during the Global Genes Unsummit. So congratulations on that.
I don't know if I should say you're welcome or I'm sorry.
Right. Anything you'd like to add to that, Fernanda?
No, I think, like you said, I think it's real. I think, I mean, yeah, I have questions, right? Was this I'm not familiar with the morning sickness and Kim Kardashian. I'm not a follower. But I wonder if it was this like a marketing. I'm just like you said, how did it come up? Like, so if it's something that it's before approval or if it's under, like Chad was saying, disease awareness, it's different than like promotional. So that's what it's very interesting.
Sounds good. We have another question here. I'm not sure if I totally understand it, so let me just read this and see if either of you would like to jump in on this next one. Patient advocacy groups and drug makers already provide information and healthcare navigation support. Could they have a role in adding social communities to be more holistic patient family supporters?
So I'm happy to go ahead and take a stab at it. I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I think it gets to how many companies, when they have a product that's approved, have a kind of a patient services group, which helps those that are on therapies understand the disease a little bit better. The patient services team can talk about what is within the label of that product in a reactive nature. And in some cases, and some companies may help with ensuring that the patients are covered under their current insurance. And so may be able to do benefits verification and checks. In terms of supporting the broader community, the broader family, and on that, there's been some precedent recently by some cases where when you start supporting or providing those types of services to individuals that are not within the label, the indication, that the view, and this is not my view, this is the enforcement agencies and Department of Justice view, is that can be deemed a kickback. You're providing something of value to the broader family outside of the services and educating around the one to the patient themselves. And so it's a very fine line. So it's very tricky. And what I think most companies try to do is they try to give that support service or try to assist patient advocacy organizations in developing that support service for the broader family, for the broader social community, and use that as a mechanism of it. So they may sponsor, for example, I'll use Global Genes to go ahead and develop a program that is aimed to support that broader community in a way where the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry really is kind of prohibited from doing so.
Anything to add to that, Fernanda?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a good example. I think that's why I was thinking about a way of supporting technology, for example, just making the support more what we call unrestricted or asking for funding from multiple sources. That's another way that is very helpful to ensure independence and make things more transparent. So I think that's one last point that we didn't touch upon, which is the ensuring funds from different organizations and again, working with third-party vendors or kind of a buffer to be in between the caregiver and the patients who are participating in studies and industry, for example. I can see that some of the patient support services, it can be very gray sometimes. So the more detail, the more transparency, the better it is for everybody. But I guess adding the multiple funding sources, that's also helpful.
We have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to thank our audience for all the great questions that have been submitted so far. If you've got anything else on your mind, we've got a few more minutes to address those, so don't be shy. In the meantime, let me ask Fernanda and Chad a question, kind of a two-sided question here, I guess. I'll leave it up to you guys about how you want to answer it, but I'm really curious about if we could share with our audience around, Chad, from your perspective on industry, what can patients be doing a little bit better, or how can we be educating them better around creating good partnerships with industry? And then maybe the flip side of that, Fernanda, would be from your perspective, what do you think industry can be doing different, better, other to help build better relationships with patients? And so, ladies first. I don't know if you'd like to get us started, Fernanda.
Sure. What can industry do better to help with advocacy organizations? So I think we can help put advocacy organizations and industry on the same page by helping educate the patient organizations on how to work together with the rules and the guidelines and the regulations that exist. Be very transparent on what is possible and what may not be possible, and continue to communicate about the changing environment in drug development. Also, I think industry can be very clear about when we will want feedback and when we'll be able to incorporate the input from patients, yes and no, but also get back to the patient groups on why sometimes it's not possible. So I think we can do that much better. And then one thing that I think we need to do better and ask of the advocacy groups and the community is for them to continue to elevate their knowledge and recognition and commitment, and be transparent about the commitment and the capacity being able to engage with industry at the right level. Because when you become a partner, again, there is responsibility that comes with it. So it elevates for everybody.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fernanda.
Right. I'll add one thing on top of that from an industry leading side, and then I'll answer the other side. I think industry can be more transparent themselves, right? And within Europe, if you belong to different trade associations as a company, you're required to publicly put on your website, what are the patient advocacy organizations you're engaging with? What are those engagements? How much is it for engagement? And, that is a practice that we have here at Bluebird, which I think, frankly, shows commitment to the patient community, right? We're being transparent of, this is who we support, this is what we support, this is how much it was. And, I think personally, that should be something every company within industry does, just as a best practice. So on the other side of it, from a patient side, ask the questions when you're working with your patient advocate contact within the company. Ask, what types of things, would you be open to? What, how, really build that collaboration between the two. If you submitted something for funding request, or you're looking to get assistance and the company says we can't do that, or unfortunately your request did not get approved, ask why. Build up that knowledge base, and I think that will help the organizations really kind of evolve and understand, okay, the parameters where this company is operating under, what their risk tolerance is, what they'll support, what they won't support. And I think that will work to make interactions much more effective and efficient, and will really allow the patients and patient groups to, truly support the community more, instead of filling out these grant requests into a black hole, which I have once been told, not at my current company, I've been told by a patient group that's what it felt like when they were filling out our grants portal. But I think asking those questions, well, why is this? Why are you asking for these things? Why do you need an agenda and a budget, and to know where it's being held? And because these are all things that we take into account whenever we're looking to support an organization or a specific event. because of, we're managing, and many times we're managing perception. And, that perception, it's the hardest thing because, we're always looking at it from what the most cynical person would look at, right? Like, and that's why we may not support that, the coffee and donuts in the morning. It's because, from a cynical person's point of view, it's you're just giving donuts to patients, right? So anyway, but this has been a great pleasure talking with you and having Scott and Fernanda as a excellent panelists. And thanks so much, Scott, for stepping in and moderating.
You guys have been fantastic. I think that the term compliance might not get everybody jumping out of bed with excitement in the morning, but you've made it super interesting and really educational. I'd like to thank Fernanda Copeland. I'd like to thank Chad Morin. I'd like to thank our audience for all the great questions. We've reached the top of the hour. I do just want to remind everyone there is one final event here at Global Genes. Let me just read this session off to you real quick. It's called Building on Hope, Finding Unity in Uncertain Times, which sounds very relevant in 2020. So I hope you can attend that session. And thanks everyone for attending our session today. And again, Fernanda and Chad, thank you guys for your thoughtful insights. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.